So, the bell ringer, of course, today goes along with the topic that we'll be discussing. The bell ringer was what do you know about lower, middle, and upper class in Europe in the 17th and 18th centuries? Because there's obviously going to be some changes that occur during this period of time. And that's what the readings for this week, chapter 7 and 8, go over society and economic changes. Once again, please make sure that you look at your page numbers for that information. But just looking at the material, of course, the title of the unit is Society and Economy. This is the fifth one. And so it's important to know that we're going to be looking at a transition from what was called the old regime. The old regime was the old feudal patterns of society. So both the class system, the economy, politics, and so on. And it was especially emphasized and kept in place in France up through the Revolution. We saw a rigid system where the church played a significant role, and so did the class system, especially since the nobles were considered at the top. In France, in particular, though, the priests held a special place above everyone else. But the old regime included the aristocratic elites who inherited legal privileges. So in the law, it specified that these noble families had certain rights over common lands, over hunting, over food resources, or even creating monopolies over certain types of industry within the areas that they inhabited. So the aristocratic elites were a hallmark of the old regime. Also, the established church system, as I just mentioned. In France, it was the Catholic Church. In Britain, it was the Church of England. And in other places, they went with different Protestant denominations, such as, for instance, Lutheranism in the Scandinavian states. So established churches were a part of this as well. And then the urban labor force. The people that we saw living in cities, and once again, it's still a minority of the population. They would be organized into what we call guilds, where they specifically outlined a role that they would play, an apprentice system that they would have, and then expected pay that they would receive. And then, of course, there's the rural peasantry. They would make up the overwhelming supermajority of the population and did a lot of the work, but were also subject to an extremely high level of taxes. Most of these people were involved in farm work, but of course, obviously, as the countries industrialized, that would decrease. And so it was predicated on the fact that there were certain traditions to follow. There was a hierarchy, there was privilege, and there was little concept of what we call individual rights. So that wasn't necessarily heard of. And typically, when we thought of countries at the time, you thought of them through the nobles that ruled over them. So the idea of being French and having a nationalistic aspect to it didn't quite exist yet in many of these places. The aristocracy only made up between maybe 1 and 5% of the population, depending upon each country. So they were an extremely small minority, but yet had most of the privileges in society. Much of their wealth was based on land. The fact that they had control over land, even if they didn't own it themselves, they still had rights as the noble over property, even if someone else owned it. So they would get to decide maybe what laws would be enforced and what type of activity would take place. Manual labor for a noble was considered beneath them. So no aspect even of household services was going to be done by a noble. If they ever got caught doing that, of course, they would be frowned upon by their peers.
That's why they were pale.
That's right. As actually back then, if you had a tan, that was considered to be unattractive because it meant that you were poor, you had to work outside. Same thing with being skinny. That was thought of as unattractive as well because it meant that you had to do a lot of manual labor. If you were plump and healthy, then therefore you were thought of as being well off. So there was interest in economic growth and innovation, but often aristocrats themselves didn't participate in that type of activity. And the British nobility, in particular, was the smallest out of all the noble classes, but they were one of the most wealthy. There's only about 400 families in Britain that were considered noble at the time, but they did own about 25% of all land that could be farmed. The French nobility was less clear cut because they continually added people to the nobility. There were people that were called nobles of the sword, which meant that they had gotten their titles through military service. There were nobles of the robe who got their service through working, for instance, for the government, administering things. And in France, there was a great divide between nobles maybe that were wealthy and nobles that were poor. In Eastern Europe, military tradition played one of the greatest roles in nobility. And they had extensive power not just over the land, but all the people that lived in it, especially when serfdom existed. So the difference between slavery and serfdom was that slaves are owned directly by an individual, serfs were tied to the land, and then that land was controlled by a noble. As the middle class grew and you saw more business owners, merchants, artisans moving up, there was a kind of resurgence of aristocratic concern when it came to controlling society. So they wanted to preserve their privileges, and they had a great disdain for these common people that seemed to be making money and moving up. So they attempted through legal means in many countries to make sure that only they could serve, for instance, as officers. They were the only ones that could make major economic decisions or settle disputes between others. So, in some places that worked, in some places it didn't. And then, of course, there were the peasants and serfs who made up the majority of the population. They were extremely exploited and also vulnerable. Really, they didn't have any means to travel. Especially in Eastern Europe, it was unusual for the lower class to even own animals, for instance, that could be used for transportation or hauling.
Sparta wasn't Sparta like the same? They had a lot of serfs. The Spartan population was like aristocrats.
France, the poor also had to pay what were called feudal dues. And so they had to pay money to the nobles that were supposedly protecting them. In the Habsburg lands, including Austria, the serfs had mandatory labor that they had to perform on behalf of their nobles. And in Russia, the peasants were even undervalued further, and their movement was restricted even more. Because in Russia, the nobles didn't have a status based on the number of acres they owned, but the number of serfs that existed on those acres. So that is what determined how powerful they were.
Did they fight over serfs?
Yes, that was one of the things that kept them moving up in powers if they were somehow able to get serfs. And so that could be done through acquisition of land, so that way the serfs would come with them, or it could be done through conflict, which was also possible. That's often why sometimes rulers like the czars, said that they were cracking down on nobles to get rid of dissenters, but it was also a bonus that you could also get a hold of all their property and therefore serfs at the same time. But the peasants, of course, didn't always put up with it. There were examples of rebellions that occurred. Pugachev's rebellion, which is spelled Pugachev, that's Pugachev. Pugachev Rebellion, which was from 1773 to 75. 73 to 75 was a huge uprising of
1773.
Yep. Huge uprising of Russian peasants that obviously lasted for a couple of years, involved thousands of people. But in the end, of course, the main concern of the nobility was to stop something like this from happening. And that included everyone, even if there were nobles that were enemies of each other and it was your enemies' serfs that rebelled and not yours, you would still not want this to happen because then it might encourage this to spread. And there are also smaller revolts throughout Eastern Europe. In Western Europe, though, you saw hardly any. Usually, because of the rising middle class in Western Europe, the peasants could often express their concerns through them. And there are also legal means to do that too. After all, in the West, you had, for instance, like Britain, the House of Commons, where concerns could be floated. And so people felt like they had their voices heard. But even though that did occur and there were no revolts necessarily in Britain for a long time, there were still attempts to try to keep control over all aspects of society. For instance, in Britain, the English game laws were meant to give extensive rights to landowners in particular. English landowners, including lords, who once again controlled an enormous amount of the property, had exclusive rights to hunt game. Whenever middle class people who owned land wanted to protect those rights for themselves, they would often hire, for instance, gamekeepers in order to protect against things like poaching. And killing deer by unauthorized persons became a capital crime. But needless to say, with such a huge amount of people, especially peasants, not owning their own land and having access to game, poaching was still incredibly popular. And there was a large black market for meat. And then family structure. Family was the most basic unit for things like production and consumption. Most families existed with, of course, a married couple and approximately 5 to 6 members in their family altogether. However, men and women, especially in Western Europe, didn't marry particularly early. Not marrying, for instance, if they were men until 26 and women 23. Yeah, that's more in common with what there is today. But back then, most people might think it was happening in their teens, but that wasn't the case. And of course, people typically from the peasant class, if they were ambitious and they got into their teen years, they would often leave home in order to go work as a servant somewhere else. And sometimes it might not even be for pay, it might be for something as simple as room and board. Eastern Europe was a lot different, though. Marriage was usually before the age of 20, and it was often arranged. People in Eastern Europe often lived in multiple generation households, 3 to 4 generations. Sometimes it's anywhere from 9 to 20 people per household. And so most productivity took place, existed within what we call the family economy. So production took place. So even if this household, their only purpose is to be serfs and to work the fields for their local lord, the entire family would be engaged in that activity. If they were an artisan, then the father was probably the person who crafted the material, the wife helped sell them, and the children apprenticed to learn the trade. So often the family worked together in any type of occupation that existed. The death of the father obviously had a huge impact, and it often meant disaster, surprisingly, in the West. In the West, where the peasants had a little bit more independence, the family totally depended upon the status of the father.
If the son was trained in his trade.
Yeah, if he was trained and he was of the right age, he might be able to take over. If he wasn't, though, then that would be a problem. In Eastern Europe, though, if the father died, it didn't really matter because, once again, they lived in these households of 3 or 4 generations. And then children. Having children was extremely dangerous, not only for mothers, but also for the children, too. It was not surprising for children to die before the age of 2. That happened quite a bit. In some cases, if it wasn't advantageous, then often, especially amongst the peasant class and sometimes among wealthier people, it would be more preferable to commit infanticide, to leave their children out in the open in the wilderness, possibly to die.
Is that common?
I don't want to say it's common. I don't want to say every family had at least one kid killed. It wasn't like that, but it wasn't completely unheard of. And then there were things like foundling hospitals that were established to take in abandoned children. What's that? Yeah, something like an orphanage. And then amongst the upper class, you also, once again, this is something that fell out of favor, but at one point in time in the past, you had a thing called wet nursing, where those that were more successful mothers, at least economically speaking, because they had busy lives organizing their household or assisting their husbands, they might have another woman that would breastfeed their children. But once again, over time, that fell out of favor. For the remainder of the period, go ahead and continue to work on what you started on. Hopefully you can get it done for the day. And tomorrow we'll continue by talking about agriculture a little bit more.